Hi, welcome to Faith, Politics, and Everything in Between. I'm Hillary Earle, and today we're going to talk about an interesting topic. Is abortion or the pro-choice movement racist at its core? So I wanted to talk about this because abortion is one of the lead causes of the death of Black people. And I want to propose the question, is this coincidental or was this intentional? And what's interesting is, as a culture, we kind of have all agreed that fascism is evil, the Nazis were evil, the Holocaust, Hitler, all of that represents the greatest heights of evil that we have ever seen in our history. Yet the same ideology, the same evil ideology that drove the Holocaust, that drove Hitler, is the same ideology that drove the founding and development of the pro-choice abortion movement. And I want to get into that and talk a little bit about how it was kind of structured on racial lines. Also, I would like to ask questions. If this really is about, if what they tell us today, that abortion is really about healthcare and reproductive rights, then why do we fund abortion only but not fertility treatments or adoption efforts? If this is truly about women's reproductive rights and healthcare. The left tries to claim that they care more about racial minorities than conservatives or Republicans do. But if that's true, then why are the conservatives the ones fighting for pro-life, fighting for more Black births, where the left and the liberal is fighting against it? Wouldn't the white supremacist that they claim some MAGA folks are, wouldn't it make more sense for the racists to be in the pro-choice abortion camp? So I want to talk a little bit about abortion stats to get started. So the reality is Black women have the highest abortion rates, followed by Hispanics. White women have the lowest, according to globalstatistics.com. 1 million abortions per year occur in the United States, or 70 million plus each year worldwide. I've read that stat so many times, and it still stops me in my tracks. We are killing 70 million people a year. In 2023, there were 3.5 million live births in the US, 14% to Black moms. Well, that makes sense because the Black population is about 14% of the US population. Yet 51% of abortions are to Black moms. So triple, okay? Why is abortion taking out triple the number of Blacks? In fact, in the state of New York, they recently published that more Black babies are aborted each year than are born. Was this intended? So in order to kind of answer that question, we've got to take a look at the beginning and the founding of the abortion industry, the pro-choice industry. And we can't do that without first looking at Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood. Now, at the time of its founding in the 1930s, Margaret Sanger championed reproductive restrictions, so birth control. Abortion wasn't legal at the time, but what's interesting is she championed it for certain groups, what she considered to be unfit populations. And we're going to get into that. So she was, her core belief was she was a eugenicist. And the eugenicist movement was big in the early 1900s. It started probably late 1800s, but really had gotten a lot of momentum in the early 1900s in the United States and in other countries, to include Germany, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But what the belief of the eugenicist is that undesirable traits in humans, like in animals, you know how in animals you can kind of breed two animals, like people will breed racehorses, two really fast ones in order to try to get like a really fast thoroughbred. So that's called animal husbandry, okay? So they would generally breed to try to get better traits. Well, the science of the day, which we now know is, flawed and wrong, but the science of the day was founded in eugenicist theory. And this theory believed that in the same way, undesirable traits in humans could be breeded out or could be reduced by stopping the reproduction of certain groups. Now, the only problem is it's kind of like, hey, like blue eyes are recessive, brown eyes are dominant. They believed that it wasn't just tied to hair color and skin color and things like that. They believed that characteristics like poverty, being poor, okay, they called it pauperism, that this was a genetic trait. And this was bad for society to let the paupers or the poor procreate, okay? They saw they divided along racial lines, specifically targeting blacks and brown people as being lesser races according to the eugenicist, okay? They wanted to slow their reproduction. Other things were criminality. Okay, so if somebody, you know, had criminal behavior, then they believed it was better for society to perhaps sterilize that person than have to imprison their children one day. And another one was what they called sexual deviance. So if somebody had a baby out of wedlock, they were considered to be a sexual deviant or someone that was promiscuous. These were all attributes that they attributed to genetics, not choice, not circumstance. And they felt it was their job for the good of society to try to weed out these populations. So that's the general definition of eugenics, okay? And again, this is something I'll talk about in a little bit, that went all the way up to our Supreme Court. So this wasn't a fringe idea. This is something that was really front and center. So for example, there's, when I said it went all the way up to our Supreme Court, there was a case, Bucks versus Bell. Carrie Bucks was a young girl that was in a foster home. And in that foster home, she was raped by her foster parents' nephew. She got pregnant at 13 years old. The state believed that because she was kind of a ward of the state, she got pregnant, that they had a right, the state had a right to sterilize her so that she wouldn't continue to have children that would be a burden on the state. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So they believed they had a right to sterilize, as they called it, the feeble-minded. That was another character trait. If someone was feeble-minded, so if they were a little slow, unfortunately, often people that were just uneducated and were never taught to read fell into this category, and they were being sterilized, okay? So compulsive sterilization, the Bucks versus Bell case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they decided compulsive sterilization did not violate the Constitution, which of course is nuts. And if you want to read the case law on it, they basically said that it would be a kindness to society to sterilize somebody instead of having to imprison or provide for their unfit children in the future, was basically kind of the gist of it. So as we circle back to Margaret Sanger, she was a eugenicist. She founded Planned Parenthood. The goal was initially to give out birth control. Coincidentally, she was giving them out to, all of her clinics were in poor neighborhoods, close to minority neighborhoods. And if you want to really just spend a few minutes looking at some of her quotes so you really see what she believes, I have some of them here. But she says that the Population Congress, which is what she was a part of, the goal would be to give certain groups of their population the choice of either segregation or sterilization. And she refers to this as unfit populations. Who is unfit? The grosser, the feeble-minded should indeed not only be discouraged, but prevented from propagating their kind. Birth control, often denounced, is nothing more or less than facilitating the process of weeding out the unfit, preventing the birth of defective stock or those who would become defective. She also said that, and I won't use the word, but you use crayons to do this, okay? So because I don't want my video to get taken down. Those people are like human weeds and are to be exterminated. She talks about exterminating human weeds from the garden of society. Again, she says more children from the fit, less from the unfit. And she wrote a 200-page book where she called for the elimination of human weeds, the ceasing of charity to help these smaller groups, because it's not good for society to allow them to continue to procreate. So, I mean, I have some of her quotes that are just like mind-blowing. One where she talks about going to Black communities and getting the ministers to train them, to persuade their congregations to engage in birth control. And in it, she says, but it's important that we don't let them know that our goal is to reduce the Black population, okay? So you can go and look at some of her stuff. I don't want to spend too much time on her because I want to get into a few others that are really at the core of the eugenicist movement. So another person of interest, bear with me, sorry. Okay, actually, let me touch on this first. So basically at this time, so sometimes you think like, gosh, how could this be? You know, and this is really where I started researching this. I was like, okay, what was like the most evil thing that ever happened? And I always wondered, I was a history major, how did Hitler and his people get all of the Germans on board with this? And granted, many were, you know, forced into it. But prior to the concentration camps, there was a huge eugenicist movement going in Germany. In fact, bear with me, they're responsible for sterilizing, they sterilized several 100,000 people. And what they did, this is kind of crazy, they basically wanted to racially purify. And in Germany, they basically required that you had to prove your German heritage by having it in order to get even a marriage license. And people that were, let's say they had a genetic illness or they were mentally ill, the German government required that doctors report them, and then they would forcefully sterilize these people because they believed that they needed to clean up the human race. And I'm going to dig a little deeper on even where those beliefs came from. So bear with me. So some of it goes back to Sir Francis Galton. He was the father of the eugenicist movement. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Now you might remember Darwin, his theories of evolution and all of this. But Darwin kind of made famous his quote, which is survival of the fittest. And this is the idea that, you know, basically weaker animal species will automatically become extinct because they're weak, right? And it's the strongest that will continue to survive and continue and continue and continue. So this time, this has taken over the world, his theories and his book and all of his research. Now, his cousin kind of melded the eugenicist idea with that. And basically, it was presented as only the strongest traits in humanity will allow the human race to survive. So there was this sense that we need to clean up and racially purify our own species. Otherwise, we might go extinct. Now, if you think about that for a minute, you can see where some people would get on board with some atrocious things, right? If you really felt like the entire human race was potentially at risk for extinction, you might do some things like say, okay, let's get the weaker ones to procreate less, and let's get the stronger ones to procreate more so that we have more of a robust stock, if you will, okay? I know it's crazy, but this stuff comes from the pits of hell. But the reality is many, many, many people believed it, and it drove case law, it drove governments, and it drove the deaths of many. All right, so let me continue here. Going back to Germany, in 1933, they had a law for the prevention of hereditary disease in offspring. Again, I said several 100,000. 400,000 were forcefully sterilized, reported by doctors, or they were fined. They basically said that the state has the right to do this. Now, what's interesting is, as we had in, this is pretty infamous, but we had throughout the country, because this was such a big movement, in North Carolina, there was a eugenics board, okay? And they forcefully sterilized many people. And what was crazy about this is they allowed social workers to submit and get permission to sterilize people. Now look at this for a minute, okay? So a social worker who's working with families on welfare, okay? Again, this was a movement to take out the poor, to take out the minorities, who often made up the poor, okay? So to give this authority, not to doctors, but to social workers, to make a recommendation for sterilization of some of the people that were in the state's care, really elevates the idea that the government was like, yeah, we got to try to eliminate some of the folks that are dragging down society as they saw it. So what's interesting is in that eugenics board, they sterilized, I think I have the number here. They sterilized about almost 8,000 people, and 5,000 of them were Black. Often they didn't even give them informed consent. They told them they were going in for a different surgery or some sort of other medical treatment, and the board had already decided that this teenager needed to be sterilized. They sterilized both men and women. And in the sterilization of a man by the name of Joseph Moore, they basically said procreation of children who will become a burden to the state should be ceased. So what's interesting is we see shadows of this same argument today. If you ever, see these people going to like a protest, pro-life, pro-choice, whatever, and they ask someone who's pro-abortion, for their thinking, why they support it. And almost always you're going to get somebody that says, well, it would be better for the baby to be dead than for them to be born into a poor household, or for them to be raised on welfare, or blah, 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 blah. And you know what? You could just see the same eugenics root, right? Hey, it's better for you to be dead than to be poor or to be a burden on society. And this is absurd, because if you lined up those same people and said, hey, look, the economy just crashed, you're now broke. Do you want to be dead? Can we kill you? Can we give you assisted suicide? Every single one of them would be like, no, give me a chance to rebuild. And no, I'd rather be alive and broke than dead and not broke. Right? So, but you can see, and this is true of spiritual roots all the time. At the end of the day, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, but when you peel it all back, it's a death culture. It's a culture of the elites are going to, and the elites in my book, I'm not saying the elites are the rich or the this or the that. I'm saying the elites are those that are so prideful that they think that they're the fittest and it's their job somehow to manage the rest of the population. So digging a little deeper, where did some of this eugenicist ideas come from? Some of it, like I said, they kind of extrapolated from animal breeding. But one of the root theories was from a woman by the name of Madame Blavatsky. She wrote several books. The Secret Doctrine was one. She founded the Theosophical Society of 1875. In this, she wrote about various races. She wrote about several races, and she's the one that came up with the term the Aryan race. So we hear this a lot associated with Hitler, the Aryan race, blonde hair, blue-eyed. That's what he was trying to elevate. But she's the one that first penned that. And she basically said that the Aryan race was a German race, that was almost like superhero-y, superpowers. And they were elevated, they were strong, but they lost a lot of their superness, if you will, because they interbred with lesser races. And she, of course, talks about minority races and blacks and browns as being lesser and unfit and all of that stuff. So she basically says that that's why society has declined in all of the areas they've declined in. Interestingly, and we'll bring up a picture of this, but her logo for her society, part of it is the swastika. So we see now this is where Hitler took the swastika from. So this was a form of occultism, what she pretty much, she was an occultist, so she was into the satanic and all of that. She hated Christianity, she hated Jews, all of that. But she was one that wrote these books, and she had tons and tons of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers all over the world. And this is what kind of drove all this eugenicist theories, as well as some of the other things I previously mentioned. So, now moving forward, okay, that was then, this is now. How did we get to abortion? How did we go further? So Alan Gottmacher, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. He was the former BP of the American Eugenicist Society. In 1970, he was the lead voice to decriminalize abortion. His beliefs that he wrote about, what he believed that we should establish abortoriums. And they would charge for abortion, but not to the poor. So the poor would get their abortions for free. So you kind of see this thread. Abortion is the new solution, he said, for what was deemed a population problem. Then we passed the baton to Virginia Lee Warren. She founded the first abortion clinic, I think it was in Syracuse. And she identifies the basic problem. She said initially that executives on the board, let's see. So she talks about societal problems being solved, such as transportation, housing, and education. And they all go back to too much population. So this was never about women's freedom. It was pretty much really about eliminating the poor, AKA minorities. And let's see, and they even incentivized the poor to come in and get their free abortions. Bear with me, sorry. I got a lot of notes here. So, roots and motives matter. This industry was designed to along theories where they talked about racial cleansing and population control, not of all, but of lesser unfit stock. Okay, so you might say, well, that's, then, maybe things have morphed and maybe that's not the driver today. Again, I would go back to some of my original questions of, well, if that's the case, then why aren't we funding fertility treatments and adoption efforts? Why are we only funding abortion efforts? So let's fast forward and let's look at another big population controller, Bill Gates. I got to be careful how I approach this because I put this in a video once before and they had taken it down, even though it's completely true. So Bill Gates, his father was on the board of Planned Parenthood. He was known to be a eugenicist as well. Bill Gates also slips, and there's a famous video, and if we'll try to put it in here, where he talks about the Gates Foundation desire to help in global healthcare. And he talks about population size being a problem, okay? And he says if we can through vaccines and better healthcare, currently the world population is here, and if we can through better healthcare and vaccines and blah, 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 reduce it by 10 or 15%, that would be great. And it's like, wait, better healthcare, vaccines, all these things are supposed to preserve life, right? So wouldn't we think that we would see a population increase? No. So, all of this, and he says this famously. Now, what's interesting is 100 years ago, they were able to get people to agree to population control and reducing the population because otherwise the human race will go extinct. Today, I believe they're using the climate change narrative. Okay, so when Bill Gates is talking about all this, he's referring to getting down to zero carbons, okay? So we talk often about there's too many people and we have too many carbon emissions and this is going to destroy the planet. So it's just a repurposed, we have to save humanity. And we have to do this by reducing unfit populations. So let's talk, a little bit more about the Gates Foundation. So what's interesting, and I encourage you to look this up because there was both in Africa, and I wrote this down, here we go. Back in 2014, the Gates Foundation had vaccinated massive populations in Africa and in India. I'm going to talk about both. And in that, in Africa, there was problems with the jabs. Let me try to use some code words. And hundreds of thousands of young people were paralyzed. Now, what's interesting is there was no informed consent. They didn't talk to parents. They didn't get permission. They basically were giving out, gifts and beads. These kids came in. They gave it to them, and it was a real population problem. Now, another thing that was really interesting, and this is something that the Kenyan Catholic Doctor Organization had called out the Gates Foundation on the tetanus shots that they were administering. So, tetanus is, if you step on a rusty nail, you get a tetanus shot. Now, if you've had your tetanus shot, you know that you have to only get them one time every 10 years, okay? But where they started to get suspicious is they were giving these young girls multiple ones. Like, you have to come back in a couple months, you have to come back in a couple months. And so that started to make them say, wait, tetanus, you don't have to do that. What's going on? Now, when they began to independently examine these tetanus shots, they found in them the HCG hormone. Now, that is basically a hormone that tells your body that you're already pregnant, and it is like a birth control hormone, basically, because that's why women don't get pregnant on top of pregnancies, right? Now, in order to get that into anything, the way it's extracted is it has to be extracted. That hormone is extracted from pregnant women's urine. So there's no way that could accidentally happen. But as a result, and this happened in India too, there was massive sterilizations of women. Whoops. Okay, so interesting to note, especially when your dad was a eugenicist, when you've talked about population diminishment through vaccines, but I'll just leave that there. Again, I hope they don't pull this video like they did last time, but that's kind of interesting to note. All right, so we go back, and one thing I'd like to say is, and I really believe in kind of spiritual parallels. My belief is behind all evil is the father of all evil, Satan. And he will trick humans into doing things where they believe maybe they're doing society good, maybe they're just evil and hateful. But it's kind of interesting because if you look closely, you'll start to always see the same demonic pattern, right? So we go back in the Bible and we see Baal worship or Moloch worship. And this is where parents sacrifice their babies. They put them through the fire, okay? And they killed their babies to the god of Baal, to the god of Moloch. We know it was to Satan, really, right? Now we see, and it was in exchange for favor and financial blessing. And how many times do we hear people talking about like aborting their child because they weren't where they wanted to be in their career, they didn't have the money they wanted yet, and it really is the same thread. And in the same way, I look at the eugenics movement and I see like a 2.0 version, especially in an area, oddly enough, when it comes to the trans movement. So back in the 1900s in Germany, they were sterilizing people that they considered to be mentally ill. Up until about 20 years ago, gender dysphoria was considered a mental illness, okay? The treatment in Germany was to sterilize the mentally ill. Fast forward to the United States, and now, present day, and the treatment or gender affirming care being given to the gender confused happens to sterilize them. Cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, surgeries. Kind of interesting. that the same evil outcome 100 years ago for the mentally ill was forceful sterilization. Now we've kind of tricked these young people into believing that the best thing they could do is go on a path that results in their sterilization. So that's just an aside. Let's see what else I got here. Thank you for being patient. I'm new to this, so I'm going to rely on my notes a little bit more than hopefully I will down the road. So I would say this. At the end of the day, the abortion industry and Planned Parenthood was driven by the eugenics movement. And it has and continues to be the greatest eliminator of minority children and families. And so when you think you might be supporting, women's rights or choice or whatever, recognize really the pit that this came from. And I would say this, since we've made abortion legal in the United States, we have aborted more than 60 million babies. Half of them we know are Black children. And so Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood clinics have taken out more minorities than Hitler's concentration camps. And so I just kind of want to leave that there. I'm going to have some follow-up videos on this topic, but I'd like to end it and just say, if you have had an abortion, if you're thinking of one, if you know somebody that is, I would encourage you to get to a pregnancy resource center that will give you a sonogram. I volunteered at them. The amount of resources that they can connect you with are unbelievable. And if you choose, you could choose to give your child a chance and let them go to one of the millions of people that are dying to adopt a child. And at the end of the day, this abortion not only destroys the child's life, but it destroys the mother's life. I've talked to so many women, and it is a decision that will forever alter your life. It will never be something you can undo. And I just pray for you. I beg you to seek out those who love you and really love your child. And that can be judged by fruit. The ones that are willing to fight for you, march for your child, put money where their mouth is and give you resources. Seek support there. So anyway, thank you. If you like this video, please share it. And I look forward to seeing you next time.